Hey y'all, welcome to the Team LoCoFit Roundtable, hosted by me, Laurin Conlon, owner of Team LoCoFit. Each week, I am joined by one of our coaches to dive headfirst into the nutrition, training, mindset, and coaching strategies we use with our clients. If you loved the show, please subscribe, leave us a review, tell a friend, you know the drill. And for more information about coaching, the programs we offer, and additional content, visit teamlocofit.com.
All right, and this week I am joined by the amazing Dr. Gabrielle Lyon. I am so excited we finally got to make this happen. We met a few years ago at a First Form event, right? Like 2 years ago.
And I was at least. I think, no, maybe it was 2 years ago. Okay, yeah.
Yeah, time has gone so fast. But I was just blown away by, of course, how intelligent and smart you were and just all your experience. And I was like, wow, like this is an amazing person and somebody that I really look up to. And we've obviously stayed friends and stayed in contact. And I'm just so excited to be able to do these podcasts because you are so knowledgeable in these two particular areas that we're going to discuss today. So before we get started, give a little bit of a background on yourself and all that.
Yeah. Well, my name is Dr. Gabrielle Lyon, and I am a functional medicine physician, but I have had some very unique training. So my undergraduate degree is from the University of Illinois under Dr. Donald Lehman, and obviously he's still mentored me to this day, 2 decades later, and that was in human nutrition, vitamin mineral metabolism, in particular protein metabolism. Then obviously medical school, I did 2 residencies and a fellowship, and my fellowship was in nutritional sciences, obesity medicine, and geriatrics. So that kind of bridges the gap between medicine and nutrition, especially as it relates to aging and longevity.
And that's what I definitely want to talk about today, which I'm so excited. So of course, you know so much about protein. And I love that you've developed this, what you call a muscle-centric approach. So obviously that's part of your schooling, and then that's partly with your practice. So why did you develop that? Because obviously there is a gap in the, in the field.
Totally. I actually think this is a great question. The concept, so the kind of medicine I practice is really this concept called muscle-centric medicine. And it really came from exactly what you said, this experience, this clinical experience of seeing aging individuals, aging patients, diabetes, cardiovascular disease, Alzheimer's, hypertension, in medicine, because we're very symptom-based and don't really fix anything. So it really dawned on me that one of the things that all these people had in common largely was really impaired body composition. So they were all under-muscled. And notice, I didn't say over fat. We're not over fat. I mean, yes, there's an obesity problem, but it's really related to this issue that individuals don't have enough muscle. And there was one really poignant moment when I did 2 years of clinical research along with medical care. So the medical fellowship and then clinical research of 2 years. And I was in Dr. Sam Klein's lab, which is a really exceptional lab in the field of nutrition, and we were imaging people's brains. And there was this amazing woman, and she had 3 kids, and she'd been overweight her whole life, and she was in her mid-40s. And when we imaged her brain, we saw that she had, the flattening of her matter, her brain matter had changed. And what was so powerful about this was that the data supports that the wider the waistline, the lower the brain volume. So Alzheimer's, which people thought of this disease as aging, was really a disease of body composition that started in your 30s and 40s. So that's kind of like a long story, but it was very compelling as to this component of muscle-centric medicine. And I realized that, for decades, the paradigm and the narrative is incorrect. We're constantly focusing on adipose tissue. We're constantly focusing on being overweight and losing weight, when in reality, that's the wrong focus. It's really about focusing on muscle tissue as this endocrine organ and as muscle tissue as it relates to longevity.
And the problem with the over dieting or the diet is the solution, which I'm not against dieting, and that could be a whole different podcast,
totally.
Right? Like I'm not against that whatsoever. But the idea of losing weight, like you said, generally speaking, people are going to lose weight, but they're also losing muscle, because what are they doing when they're dieting? If they're dieting incorrectly, which most people diet incorrectly, they're not eating enough protein, they're not resistance training, they don't have this foundation of just any kind of muscle. And then you basically look up and now you've gone through cycles of all this dieting. You may have lost a little bit of body fat, you likely have gained some fat, and then you now have even less muscle because it's hard to build muscle.
It is.
And oh my gosh, it is so frustrating, and it's hard because people, and that's what I wanted to kind of talk, the main point I wanted to make on this podcast, okay, why is protein important in our diet? And I think that for the people listening to this podcast, we have a wide range of listeners, but obviously a lot of people think protein for muscle building, right? The bodybuilding community and the fitness community has really accepted that. You need to eat protein several times a day, everybody kind of knows that, right? But for everybody else, I hear this all the time. Oh, I don't really want to get muscular. Like, right. I just want to lose weight, or I just want to be this, or I want to, just look a little better. I'm like, that you would look better if you had more muscle. And this isn't just to like get jacked. Like, how hard it is to be really muscular.
Yeah. And it's a total misconception. And you're really lucky because of the space in which you work. People are very keen and aware that body composition really is everything. And, there is this, this kind of cross point where the leaner you are, perhaps the less healthy you are, right? But that's all about athletics. You kind of push your body to a particular limit. But, the conversation in the general public is protein is bad for my bones. I'm afraid to eat too much protein. I'm afraid of protein for the environment and cancer. And there's all these myths that are surrounded by, that protein is surrounded by, that are really incorrect narratives.
Mm-hmm. And can we go over the bone one? Because
yeah.
like,
yeah. So this one is like never ending. This one is really hard to kill. And this is the information that protein is bad for bone density and bad for your bones. Actually, that's not true. And there's multiple meta-analysis that have shown that that's not true. And there's a recent paper out. I haven't looked at it in detail, but I can tell you from clinical practice is we did bone densities. And we tracked patients, and obviously this is, more epidemiology data because, we weren't doing interventions, but the lower the protein in the diet, the more likely an individual is going to fall and break a hip. Mm-hmm. The lower their bone density, the more frequent they fracture, because bone is made from protein. Mm-hmm. So it is a total myth, and it hasn't been supported in the literature that protein has any impact on bone except for improving it.
Mm-hmm. And then also, of course, we know that resistance training, or just training in general, will help bone mineral density. So they go together. And like you said, I think that we just really need to shift this idea that protein is not just for meatheads. You know what I mean? Protein is for, your mom and your dad and your grandma and your friends, and literally everybody needs to be doing this. And I've had so many conversations with people who are outside of the, the immediate fitness circle. And, it is about educating, like, hey, like, if we're going out, like, we need to order like probably double protein, right? Or we need to order like, the largest steak here, or we need to add some egg whites with these eggs, or, having 2 eggs for breakfast is not acceptable. You know what I mean? Like, now, is that
maybe
better
when you're young,
yeah,
maybe when you're younger. So there's a lot of flexibility when you're younger, because you can stimulate skeletal muscle in other ways, whether it's just from calories, or the tissue is just primed, and you know how it is. You get a much more robust response with lower protein. But you guys, as you age, and when I say age, I'm talking about 30s.
Yeah. People think aging, they're like, oh, I don't have to worry about that. It's like, no. Well, first of all, you're aging all the time. And any chick listening knows, as soon as you hit 25, I feel like your skin just changes. You're like, like you just wake up and you're like, what the hell? Unless you have like the best genetics ever, everybody starts to change then. And especially around 30. And of course, depending on, your lifestyle beforehand and your hormonal history and all these kinds of things, there's a lot of factors, right? But things are going to change. So when we talk about aging, it's not just like, oh, I'll start doing this when I'm 50 or 60 or whatever. No, start now. Start as early as possible, because that is how you are healthy as you age and you get older. And you're allowed to, get away with a little bit more if you do take care of yourself for longer, right? Like, it's just, oh, how can you, you see people, you're like, oh, how do you eat this? And I'm like, well, you see me eating this one meal, but all my other meals are like regular meals.
And you have a high level of metabolic currency. You have a high amount of muscle mass. We know that when you think about resting metabolic rate, and listen, kidney and liver, and brain all use your metabolic rate, right? That it's all part of your metabolism. But the interesting part about skeletal muscle is it is a changeable portion of metabolism. So you actually can have direct input, and that in and of itself is interesting. And then exercising muscle. So you train hard, you lift, you do jujitsu, you do all of these things. So you're constantly moving this metabolic organ. And so, yes, you can have a meal that may be suboptimal and there's no issue.
And there's no issue. But if you have all of the meals suboptimal and you're not training,
it's a problem.
That is where all of that starts to happen. And so one thing I did want to touch on for, special considerations, especially for the aging population, right? What happens as people age with their, the muscle protein synthesis response? Like, how is that changing? And what does that look like?
So it's interesting. There is this phenomenon that happens, and it's called anabolic resistance. And what it is, it's the body's signaling pathways become less sensitive and less efficient to dietary protein. And this is one of the reasons why we see sarcopenia, which is a decrease in muscle mass, muscle function, and strength, over a period of time. And it's interesting that the body becomes less primed and less efficient with protein synthesis, and I don't want to go too much into the detail or the weeds because then we may lose some people, but that stimulation of what's called mTOR, mechanistic target of rapamycin, decreases. And that is what is responsible for turning on muscle protein synthesis. So the way to overcome that is you have a more robust meal of protein. And really you're talking 40 to 50 grams per meal, which is arguably more than a younger individual needs, but it will actually allow for an increased protein efficiency in an aging population. And listen, guys, when I say aging, it could be in your 40s is when you really want to start thinking about this, or even your 30s. But definitely, particularly once you hit 40, you really need to be thinking about these things.
And it's so hard because I feel like as people age, that's when they care less. Right.
Oh, totally. And then we're up against a narrative. So the bigger thing, it's really interesting. So the science is solid. So the science of 3 decades or 4 decades is really is solid on the efficacy of protein, the importance of protein as it relates to skeletal muscle, even as it relates to overfeeding. If an individual were to overfeed, they're much less likely to gain weight on protein. Mm-hmm. The issue comes in is when we have narratives, we have false narratives. So now we're not just up against science, we're up against a vegan, vegetarian narrative. While there's nothing wrong with that, it really has a negative impact on the ability to translate science.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and we're going to talk about that on the next podcast, which I'm very excited about. But, what is so hard is, you're talking 40, 50 grams. That's easy for me, right? Like I've been doing that for years. You've been doing that for years. Trying to explain that to, your parents or your I'm very much struggling with this with my grandma, right? Like, and obviously, things have changed dramatically in the field of nutrition or just, science in general since, and she just turned 79. So, her whole life, she grew up eating very little protein. Totally. She's a smaller person, she's not overweight, but she's under muscled, for sure. So, she has one thing going for her. She's, semi-active and she's, in a healthy weight range. That's good. That all checks out, but could she have more muscle mass? For sure. And is that something that, she was not resistance training growing up. She was not eating protein. So now, especially as people age, their taste buds change. They're less interested, particularly in meat. She's so uninterested in that. And for me to try to explain to her, like, hey, we really need to have, a scoop of protein, or we need to have 3 eggs. She's like, looks at me like 3 eggs. I could never eat 3 eggs, but she eats 2 bowls of cereal. You're like, okay. Right. So it's very hard, but it's more important, as you get older. Totally. So it's like the earlier that you can start this, and the easier you can make this on people, whether protein shakes are the most effective, or not, right? Like obviously there's always a debate about that, but it's like, is that
very effective in this group? So in the silver lined group, they're, supplementation is really important because their appetites decrease, just as you had mentioned. Taste buds decrease. Also, stomach acid decreases. So oftentimes, one of the most common things that I heard when I ran a geriatric clinic is that when I eat protein, if I eat meat, it just sits in my stomach, or I can't digest it, or I don't feel well. And that's, oftentimes there's a decrease in hydrochloric acid as individuals age. Supplementation as it relates to shakes, whey protein shakes are really good for this age group if they can tolerate it. This is where branched chain amino acids also come in with a lower protein meal. Like let's say they have 2 ounces of fish. I'll be okay with that as long as they have some branched chain amino acids, and even throwing in 5 grams of creatine is great for an aging population.
Yeah, creatine is honestly, I wish I could remember to take it more, but it is so great. And I'm like, okay, 2021, New Year's resolution, I'm going to take creatine every day. I mean, I do eat enough red meat, honestly.
Yeah,
So
you
probably,
do. So you probably don't. You're also very fit, and you have a ton of flexibility in your capacity.
but it's another really important thing. Like even like some of the research on, just brain health with creatine is super, super useful. But yeah, so touch on the branch chain. So I think it's really interesting. So first, obviously, like you talked about, okay, as a target, practical applications, what are people needing to be doing? You need to be eating protein several times a day, at least 3, right? Ideally.
So it depends. So it's interesting. So for the younger population, the overall protein amount is important. So the total amount, so if your target weight, goal weight is 150 pounds, then I recommend 150 grams of protein. The utilization, you utilize all the protein that you consume, but perhaps the benefit doesn't exceed 50 grams. So if you are going to get that 150 grams per day in, you could spread it 3 meals and you would be great. I hesitate to go below 25 grams of protein per meal because then you don't hit that, what is called a leucine threshold, which is, I'm sure you talk to your clients about, but of course, when you're younger, there's more flexibility. So that threshold actually tends to be lower. For the older population, I would be happy if they could do 2 protein targeted meals with another smaller protein meal in between.
Okay.
Which is interesting, right? So if we can get them to 40 to 50 grams, 2 meals a day, you actually can impact muscle mass for them.
Which again, most of them are not even doing that. So like just getting there would be exceptional.
Totally. So that's just a little bit of the nuance between the younger and midlife population and the aging population, because just like you had highlighted with your grandmother, they don't do that. No. But this is where branched chain amino acids could come in, because your grandma's not going to eat 6 eggs. No. But she might eat 2 eggs, and then you could give her a scoop of branched chains. Because the younger individual, the younger individual don't necessarily need branched chain amino acids. If your diet is high in protein, and again, branched chain amino acids by themselves do not allow for a complete muscle protein synthesis to happen, because they're just the branched chain amino acids. You need all the amino acids.
Yeah, I think that's gotten a bad name. Totally. I think in the industry, people are like, oh, BCAAs are trash. And it's like, in a certain context, not necessary. Right. But for some people, and again, we're going to talk about, a vegan diet a little bit more in the next podcast. But if somebody is a vegetarian or a vegan, that could be really useful, right? Totally. Or if they're just, like you said, only eating a small amount of protein, just because they either don't want to, or they don't like it, or they don't have access to it, whatever it might be, this is an easy way to offset that per meal. And it's, again, it's relatively inexpensive, and it's not going to be hard on their stomach. And this is just, again, all have to think about practical applications. I love, okay, what is optimal, right? Like everybody wants to know what's optimal, but you also have to be like, what is practical? And I think that's what you have such a great insight on, from not only just all of your schooling, but from your practice. You work with clients, so you're seeing, what are people doing? It's different when you can read a paper and be like, hey, this is what you should do, but who's going to do that?
It's totally different. Yes.
I see people, and it's not anything, it's not a knock on them, but they'll be training twice a day, 6 days a week, right? Okay. 99.9% of people can't do that. Like if you can, that's amazing, right? And I'm not saying these people are suggesting to do that, but people will say, oh, well, how do I look like this person? Or how do I do this? It's like, and then that's what they see. They're like, oh, well, I'm not even going to try because I can't do that. Or they see somebody's diet that's so extravagant, right? And they go, well, I couldn't even do that. No, you don't need to do that.
Right.
But why don't you try to do a little bit more? And
totally.
On, hitting 2 protein meals a day, having a smaller one, like great. Yeah. I do talk about like the muscle protein synthesis spike a little bit, because I do want people to understand that. And
yeah.
best?
So it's really interesting. And this largely came out of Donald Lehman's lab as it relates to muscle protein synthesis. So muscle protein synthesis is what we all want, right? It's the capacity of the body to lay down more tissue. Exactly what it sounds like. It's very particular about how it does this. Because it is such an expensive process by the body, it requires a lot of energy, a lot of ATP. The body won't even attempt it if a protein threshold, a dietary protein threshold, is not met. Specifically, a leucine threshold. So leucine is an essential amino acid, and it's one of the branched chain amino acids. So in order to stimulate muscle protein synthesis, in the literature, and there's some variation in this number, but typically the body will need 2.5 grams of leucine at one time per meal. So it's a bolus amount of leucine. So once that amino acid reaches a certain level in the blood, it then begins this process of muscle protein synthesis. And that is where the numbers come in as it relates to eating 40 grams of protein per meal or even 50, is because the key is to reach that leucine threshold and then stimulate the subsequent MPS.
And then there's also muscle protein breakdown too. So a lot of people you hear, oh, well, there's no point of eating more than a certain amount of protein. It's like, well, actually, you have to worry about muscle protein breakdown as well. And that, in Campbell's lab, they did a few overfeeding protein studies, and that's actually what we found. Basically, we overfed calories. It was about 400 calories just total, right? And they had a certain amount of protein higher. And, pretty much people didn't gain more fat on higher protein. They just gained a little bit more lean body mass, which of course is, muscle plus water and all the other constituents too.
I love how you pointed that out. Lean muscle mass.
Yes.
Not necessarily skeletal muscle. Yes.
It's very, very hard to just look at skeletal muscle mass on a human with the measurements that we have. But, so we're showing this in, on the cellular level with MPS and, muscle protein breakdown, all this, we're seeing this in humans. So it's like, hey, if you're going to overfeed on something, there actually might be a benefit to building muscle, or again, at least building lean tissue. So there really is no downside here. There's only going to be positives. And like you said, aging is not just for the 60, 70-year-old. This is for everybody. We're constantly going through an aging process, and aging is not just getting older. Aging is your body aging. Aging is, cancer. Aging is diabetes. Aging is inflammation. All of these things that people, you don't like to think about when you're younger because you feel good and you don't care. And then you wake up one day and you're like, why do I have this laundry list of problems?
Right. Or the highly catabolic, issues that an individual would have. So even if they were on bed rest or you injured yourself, I know a long time ago you tore your hamstring, you had to be off training.
Yep.
That is also a highly catabolic state. Your body is going through repair and recovery. And that's when replacing with dietary protein is so essential. Dietary protein is arguably the most important macronutrient, truly. You don't need glucose. Your body's going to generate it, right? It goes through this process of gluconeogenesis where you can generate your own glucose, even from dietary protein. And then fat, you need a small amount of essential fatty acids, but it's nothing nearly in compared to the amount of protein that you need.
Yeah. And it's, we're going to talk more about the narrative, but it really is just sad, like the combining factors of, how people have been taught to eat. And then also, like we said, lose weight, but with really no, emphasis on, resistance training and protein, because again, that has been put into the box of muscle building and bodybuilding and all this. And now I do think that it's getting better. I think that people are a lot more open to it. But we still have a really long way to go. And I think that it's so important that you're doing this work and you have this whole practice with clients and just, going around and speaking and doing all these things, because people,
and it's hard. It's like, people are like, oh, well, you're just talking about, protein and muscle. It's like, well, if I don't do it as a physician, who's going to do it?
Yeah.
You know what I mean? It's because the narrative, and I know that we're going to talk about this, is so loud. Like the mouse with the microphone and all the other aspects of what you should be eating. And, our knowledge is scary. There's a huge portion of our knowledge which is dictated to us.
Mm-hmm.
And if you don't seek out answers and think about things from a perspective of just a logical mind, you're in trouble, because then you fall victim to whatever you are fed. No pun intended.
Yeah, whatever you're fed. And I mean, the same goes for, hormone health, and the same goes for literally everything, especially, what's going on right now in this year and all this stuff. But, you go to the doctor, and until you have a problem is when things are addressed. Right. And again, I understand that, that needs to be the highest priority. If there is a problem, that needs to be taken care of first. Right. But hey, maybe we could not get to that problem if we did these other things.
Absolutely.
It doesn't mean that you could take care of yourself. You always hear these stories. Person ate great, they're in good shape, they had a heart attack and died. Okay, of course, right? Oh, you took care of yourself, you did all these things, and you got this really aggressive form of cancer, and that happens, right? But those are always the exceptions. So if you can do certain things to take care of yourself, eating protein, and really just focusing on that on like a meal per meal basis is so important. It's not just for being a bodybuilder. So for everybody listening, I think that, you guys understand that, but I think that to get this message out to people that you care about is what's important. And a lot of people listening are coaches, or they are trainers or whatever, so they're doing this in their own field too. And this is what we're up against. Resistance training, is not just about if you want to do a bodybuilding show.
No, muscle is an endocrine organ. It secretes myokines, right? It does all of these things. There's a secretory crosstalk that happens from contracting tissue. It's just very interesting. And the science is still very new, especially with exercise immunology as it relates to skeletal muscle and these myokines, which are, typically categorized as cytokines, but are myokines like interleukin 6 when released from skeletal muscle. Very interesting stuff that, again, the science is extremely new.
Yeah. And even just with training, right? Like people, you're training and you're breaking tissue down. Even if you're not, you have to build that back up, not even get bigger, right? Like we're not even talking about getting bigger. We're just talking about breaking it down and getting back to kind of baseline. And that's where it's like, all right, we need some protein to get here. If you really want to get like, you want to look like Ronnie Coleman, cool. We know how to do that too. But that is not what most people are going to ever want to do, nor that they need to. And their 3 protein meals a day are not going to get them there. You know what I mean? So it's like, we're just trying to, train and recover and have a healthy system. And it's so important. And I'm so glad that you're doing this work and you've been so vocal about this. And I'm very excited for the next one too, because again, the narrative, particularly around red meat, has been bastardized completely.
It's outrageous.
It really is. Remember you sent me something from that, it was like an obesity, like a...
Yeah. It was really disappointing, actually. It was really disappointing. I think I was so upset. Oh my God, I was so upset. So as you guys know, Laurin and I are friends and we have a lot of similar interests. I sent her, so I did a fellowship in obesity medicine. That was part of my fellowship. And there's, it's really important as physicians and as coaches and as trainers that you all stay relevant and you're continuing your education. And there was this just goes to show how deep everything goes. There was a whole, like days about red meat being bad, about how veganism should be promoted in obesity. I mean, and just the narrative was so incorrect. And the disturbing part was, as a physician with 7 years of nutritional sciences training, so I did 7 years with one of the world leading experts, and then a fellowship in a very prestigious institution, which I, of course, was like, I don't know what I'm doing here. This shit is so hard. But the narrative that we're teaching the practitioners is actually incorrect, and very agenda driven. It is frightening. It is frightening, the information out there.
Yeah.
I was very upset. I was very, very personal,
It's the same. Every industry has issues, you know what I mean? But this one seems to be very, very pervasive. And, because there is such little training in traditional MD programs, right? Yeah. You get a class or two, you hear this and you think, okay, I'm just going to write it off. And, okay, yeah. If, oh, this is high, like, cut this out, or you don't need to be eating as much meat. And you're like, okay, did you ask any other questions? Do you even know if I'm eating meat? Right? Like these are the questions that people have, or the statements that they have, and they have even no idea what's going on with some of these.
Listen, obesity, you have to control for calories. And if you are in a metabolic state of dysregulation, you have to control carbohydrates because you have to get insulin under control. Mm-hmm. You cannot go a vegan diet which, by the way, according to NHANES data, which is our largest data set, we are already eating 70% plant-based proteins. Our diet is already not 70% plant-based proteins. We're already eating 70% plant products, whether it's potatoes or grains or whatever. We're already eating plant-based.
Yeah.
I mean,
we're gonna cover that on the next one. So we're gonna wrap this one up. I am so happy that we went over this, and I really hope that this was useful, you guys. If you have any questions, you can let us know. But having this muscle-centric approach and really, distinguishing between, okay, yes, there is obviously over fat that we need to deal with, but under muscled is
that's really the problem.
More important.
Yeah.
So small steps will help, and hopefully these tips will help, especially people who are really struggling here. Thank you so much again, and we will be back for the next podcast will be all about red meat and just kind of all the narrative and all this. I'm very excited, and we'll catch you guys then.